In 1982, four of the biggest names in progressive rock came together to form what the industry believed would be the ultimate supergroup. The guitarist from Yes, the singer from King Crimson, the drummer from Emerson Lake Palmer, the keyboardist from the Buggles. Their debut album hit #1, stayed there for 9 weeks, sold over 10 million copies worldwide. It was the best-selling album in America that year. Not the best-selling rock album, the best-selling album, period. And within 18 months, the band was already tearing itself apart. Because Asia wasn't built on friendship. It was built on 4 extraordinary talents who happened to be available at the same time. And the moment success arrived, it exposed a fault line that had been there from the very first rehearsal. At the center of that fault line was Steve Howe. This is the Steve Howe problem Asia couldn't survive. By the early 1980s, progressive rock was supposed to be dead. And honestly, it looked that way. Punk had arrived in 1976 and 1977 and torn the old guard apart. The Sex Pistols called bands like Yes dinosaurs. New wave was taking over. Synthpop was on the rise. The press had declared that the era of 20-minute guitar solos, concept albums, and triple gatefold artwork was finished. The bands that had defined the 70s, Yes, Emerson Lake Palmer, King Crimson, Genesis, had either broken up, lost key members, or were struggling to find a new identity in a world that had moved on without them. Yes had splintered. Emerson Lake Palmer had imploded. King Crimson had been deliberately dissolved by Robert Fripp. These weren't bands in decline, they were empires in ruins. The musicians who'd built them were scattered across London and Los Angeles, looking for something new, looking for a way to matter again. And then John Kalodner made a phone call. Kalodner was an A&R executive at Geffen Records. He'd signed Foreigner. He'd signed AC/DC to Atlantic. He had an instinct for commercial potential, and in late 1980, he had an idea. What if you took the best musicians from the dying world of prog rock and pointed them toward the new world of arena rock? Not a prog band, not a pop band, something in between. Something that could fill stadiums and dominate radio at the same time. He brought together John Wetton and Steve Howe. Wetton was a bassist and singer who'd played in King Crimson during their most brutal era, the Lark's Tongues in Aspic years. He'd also fronted UK, a short-lived but brilliant prog outfit. His voice was rich, powerful, and melodic. He could sing a love ballad and make it sound like it mattered. Steve Howe was one of the most celebrated guitarists in rock history. He'd spent the 70s in Yes, helping to create albums like Close to the Edge and Fragile. His playing was unlike anyone else's, a fusion of classical technique, jazz phrasing, country picking, and rock power. He could make a guitar sound like an orchestra. He could also make it sound like a weapon. They were joined by Carl Palmer, the drummer from Emerson Lake Palmer. Palmer was a technical monster, fast, precise, theatrical. And finally, Jeff Downes, the keyboardist who'd been in both the Buggles and Yes. Downes had co-written Video Killed the Radio Star, one of the most iconic pop singles of the late 70s and the first video ever played on MTV. 4 men, 4 legends, 4 completely different artistic temperaments. On paper, it was a dream. In practice, it was a time bomb. The first thing you need to understand about Asia is that they weren't a band in the traditional sense. They didn't grow up together. They didn't spend years in vans eating bad food and learning each other's rhythms. They were hired guns with Hall of Fame resumes, assembled by a record label that saw a market opportunity. That's not a criticism, it's just a fact. And it matters because it explains everything that came after. They recorded their debut at Townhouse Studios in London in the second half of 1981. The producer was Mike Stone, who'd worked with Queen and Journey. Stone understood how to make big, polished, radio-ready rock. And that was the mission. Take these 4 progressive rock virtuosos and make them sound accessible, catchy, direct. Give people the musicianship without the complexity. The album came out in March 1982. It was called simply Asia. Roger Dean, the artist who'd painted every Yes album cover, designed the artwork. A dragon emerging from a sphere. Mythic, otherworldly. It looked like the prog rock people already knew. But the music didn't sound like prog. Not exactly. It was tighter, hookier. The songs were shorter. The structures were more conventional. It was progressive musicianship wrapped in pop rock packaging. And it worked. Heat of the Moment was the lead single. It hit number 4 on the Billboard Hot 100 and number 1 on the mainstream rock chart. It was the last song they'd written for the album, almost an afterthought, and it became one of the defining rock anthems of the entire decade. Only Time Will Tell followed and cracked the top 20. Soul Survivor hit the top 10 on the rock chart.
The album itself climbed to number 1 on the Billboard 200 in its 7th week and stayed there for 9 weeks. Not consecutive. Paul McCartney's Tug of War bumped them for 3 weeks in the middle, but 9 total. It was certified 4 times platinum in the United States. Globally, it moved over 10 million copies. None of these musicians, despite decades of collective experience in some of the most respected bands in rock, had ever had a number 1 album before. Not in Yes, not in King Crimson, not in ELP, not in the Buggles. Asia did it on their first try. And that's when the problems started. Success hit Asia like a truck. And unlike bands that build slowly, touring small clubs for years, learning to fight and make up, developing the muscle memory of compromise, Asia went from rehearsal room to the top of the charts in a matter of months. There was no slow climb, no learning curve. One day they were 4 guys from dissolved prog bands. The next day, they had the biggest album in America. That speed created a problem. They'd never built the foundation that successful bands usually depend on. The shared history, the trust, the ability to have an argument and come back the next day and still play together. Bands that spend years in vans develop that resilience. Asia skipped that step entirely, and when the pressure came, there was nothing underneath to hold them together. Steve Howe, in particular, had a complicated relationship with what was happening. He was a serious musician, a perfectionist, a man who'd spent the 70s pushing the boundaries of what a guitar could do in a rock context. He'd helped create Close to the Edge, one of the most ambitious albums in rock history. He played on Fragile, on Tales from Topographic Oceans, on Relayer. These were albums that demanded everything from everyone who played on them. And now his biggest commercial success was a 4-minute pop rock song with a synth hook and a chorus designed for FM radio. He wasn't ungrateful, but he was conflicted. The music critic in him could hear the difference between Close to the Edge and Heat of the Moment. One was a symphony, the other was a single. And while the single was making him more money than the symphony ever had, the artist in him couldn't fully embrace it. He'd later reflect that the whole thing just got out of control. None of them were prepared for what happened. Meanwhile, John Wetton was dealing with his own problems. Success and alcohol were mixing badly. The champagne breakfasts on tour were becoming less of a joke and more of a warning sign. Howe later said the tour supporting the debut album got out of control. He started driving himself to shows rather than flying with the band. People were forgetting parts on stage, forgetting set lists, forgetting whether they were supposed to play the single version or the album version. It was messy, and it was only the beginning. In August 1983, Asia released their second album, Alpha. It went platinum. It hit the top 10 in the US. It spawned 2 singles. Don't Cry reached the top 10, and The Smile Has Left Your Eyes charted well. By any normal measure, Alpha was a success. But Asia didn't live by normal measures. They lived by their debut. And compared to 9 weeks at number 1 and 10 million copies sold, Alpha felt like a step backward, a decline, a warning. The critics were harsher this time. They said the music was softer, more polished, less adventurous. Some said Asia was becoming what progressive rock fans had always feared, a watered-down version of its own potential. The very thing that had made the debut exciting, the tension between progressive ambition and pop accessibility, was leaning too far toward the pop side. And here's the detail that made it worse. Nobody in the band was happy with the mix of the album. Not Howe, not Palmer, not Wetton, not Downes. They all heard something they didn't like, but they couldn't agree on what was wrong because they couldn't agree on what the band was supposed to sound like in the first place. Howe and Palmer wanted more musical complexity. They were virtuosos. They'd spent the 70s playing music that demanded everything a musician could give. And now they were being asked to simplify, to compress, to fit inside a 4-minute radio format that felt like a cage to people who'd built their careers on breaking cages. Wetton and Downs were the primary songwriting team, and their instinct leaned toward melody and accessibility. They understood that the debut had succeeded precisely because it bridged the gap between prog and pop, and they wanted to keep pushing in that direction. Bigger hooks, wider audiences, more radio play. This wasn't an argument that could be resolved, because both sides were right. The debut had worked because it contained both impulses in perfect tension. But tension can't be manufactured. It either exists naturally or it doesn't. And by the time Alpha was released, the balance was gone. The two camps had formed. The middle ground was disappearing. And then the Alpha tour collapsed. Wetton's drinking had worsened. Shows were canceled. Communication broke down. In September 1983, after a show near Detroit, the band had a backstage conversation that ended with Wetton either leaving or being fired, depending on who you believe. Wetton later called it a Machiavellian conspiracy. Howe and Palmer said Wetton had made touring impossible. The truth was probably somewhere in the middle. With a major televised concert in Tokyo already booked for December, a satellite broadcast on MTV called Asia in Asia, the band scrambled for a replacement. Carl Palmer called his old ELP bandmate Greg Lake. Lake said yes, learned the material in a matter of weeks, and performed at the Budokan. It was the first concert in MTV history to be broadcast live via satellite. But Lake was a temporary fix. He didn't fit the material. His voice was wrong for the songs. He left after 2 months. Wetton agreed to come back. But he had one condition. Steve Howe had to go. This is the moment the whole story turns. And it's the moment you need to understand if you want to grasp the Steve Howe problem. Wetton's demand wasn't random. He believed Howe had been instrumental in pushing him out. He believed Howe and Palmer had conspired with management to make him the scapegoat for the Alpha Tour disaster. And whether that was true, or whether Wetton's drinking had genuinely made touring impossible, or whether it was some messy combination of both, the result was the same. Wetton resented Howe, deeply. He later admitted it candidly. He said he'd squeezed Howe out the same way Howe had squeezed him out. He said he wanted his toy back and was prepared to do absolutely anything to get it. Think about what that means. Two of the most talented musicians in rock history, men who had created one of the best-selling albums of the decade together, were now treating the band like a zero-sum game. If Wetton was in, Howe had to be out. There was no room for both of them anymore. The partnership that had generated Heat of the Moment and Only Time Will Tell couldn't survive the human mess behind it. So Steve Howe, the guitarist who'd helped build Asia from nothing, who'd been brought together with Wetton by Kolodner at Geffen, who'd co-written the songs that made them famous, who'd brought a decade of progressive rock credibility to the project, was out. Replaced by Mandy Meyer, a Swiss hard rock guitarist from the band Crocus. Meyer was skilled, but he was a fundamentally different kind of player. His style pulled Asia further from its prog roots and closer to straight-ahead 80s metal. The resulting album, Astra, came out in 1985. It had its moments, but it lacked the chemistry that had made the debut special. The tension between sophistication and simplicity was gone. Without Howe, Asia sounded like a good arena rock band. With Howe, they'd sounded like something that had never existed before. Sales were disappointing. The magic had left the room. By 1986, Asia had effectively dissolved. The supergroup dream was over in just 4 years. Except it wasn't really over. Nothing in rock music ever is. The name is always worth something, and Asia's name was worth a lot. Jeff Downs kept the brand alive, and you have to give him credit for that, because he was the one constant in every version of Asia that ever existed. From 1981 to the present day, Downs has appeared on every single studio album. He's the only original member who can say that. He outlasted the egos, the feuds, the firings, and the funerals. While Howe went back to Yes and Wetton spiraled and Palmer focused on other projects, Downs stayed. He kept the door open. The most significant chapter of the Downs-era Asia involved John Payne, a vocalist and bassist who fronted the band from 1991 to 2006. Payne actually recorded more albums with Asia than the original lineup ever did. He was talented. He was committed. He brought stability to a band that had never known it. The music was solid, polished AOR with keyboards up front and big melodies. But it was always a different band. The name was the same. The logo was the same. Roger Dean still did the artwork. But the spirit of the original experiment, four legends from four dying bands creating something new and dangerous, was gone. Pain-era Asia was a professional touring act. Original Asia had been a cultural event. Meanwhile, Steve Howe went back to Yes, multiple times. Yes had its own revolving door of lineups, and Howe was in and out of the band for decades. He also formed GTR with Steve Hackett from Genesis, another supergroup that burned bright and fast. He released solo albums. He played sessions. He was a musician who refused to stand still. He always had another project, another collaboration, another idea pulling him away from whatever he'd just finished. And then, in January 2006, something nobody expected happened. All four original members of Asia, Wetton, Howe, Downes, and Palmer, sat down together at a hotel in Paddington, London, and they agreed to reunite. 23 years. That's how long it had been since the original lineup had imploded. 23 years of revolving doors and replacement players, and the name Asia attached to music that most fans of the original didn't fully recognize. And now, suddenly, the four of them were in the same room again. Fans around the world were stunned. This was the reunion people had stopped believing was possible. Not Downes and Payne and hired guns, the real Asia. The four legends who'd made 1982's biggest album. The plan was to celebrate 25 years since the band's formation. They'd tour the world and play the debut album in its entirety. They'd prove that the chemistry wasn't gone, just dormant. And it largely worked. A new album called Phoenix came out in 2008. The title was perfect, a band rising from its own ashes. It wasn't the debut. Nothing was ever going to be the debut. But it was recognizably Asia in a way that nothing had been since Alpha. Wetton's voice was older but still powerful. Howe's guitar still had that unmistakable clarity. Palmer still hit like a machine. Downes still painted everything in wide, cinematic keyboard strokes. World tours followed. 3 more studio albums, Omega, XXX, and Gravitas. Real music, real commitment. The reunion had substance. It wasn't just a nostalgia grab. Howe stayed with the reunion until 2013, when he left again, this time amicably, to focus on Yes and his solo work. He was replaced by Sam Colson. The remaining 3 members continued. But even in the reunion years, the fundamental dynamic never changed. Howe was always the one with one foot out the door. Not because he didn't care, because he cared about too many things. His ambition was restless. His creativity was relentless. He couldn't sit still in one band because he wasn't a one-band musician. He never had been. Not in Yes, not in Asia, not anywhere. That restlessness was the engine that made Asia extraordinary. And it was the instability that made them impossible to maintain. On January 31st, 2017, John Wetton died from colon cancer. He was 67 years old. He'd been battling the disease for nearly 2 years. The cancer had taken 20 months to consume him, according to Carl Palmer, who watched it happen with the helpless clarity of a friend who'd known him for decades. 3 weeks before his death, Wetton had announced he was pulling out of Asia's upcoming U.S. arena tour, a co-headlining run with Journey, to undergo another round of chemotherapy. He hoped to rejoin later. He said he was optimistic. He never got the chance. Jeff Downes wrote that he'd lost his dearest friend, his brother, his bandmate, and his long-term musical collaborator. He called Wetton one of the world's finest musical talents. He said it had been a massive privilege to work with him. Carl Palmer said the world had lost another musical giant. He praised Wetton's voice, his songwriting, and his courage, not just in fighting cancer, but in fighting the alcoholism that had nearly destroyed his career and his life 30 years earlier. Because that's part of this story, too. The drinking that had derailed the Alpha Tour in 1983, the chaos that had gotten Wetton fired, or pushed out, depending on the version. He'd eventually confronted it, gotten sober, and spent the last 11 years of his life helping others fight the same battle. Palmer called that triumph an inspiration. It was. The man who'd nearly been consumed by his own demons had beaten them. And then cancer took what the drinking couldn't. Wetton is survived by his wife Lisa and his son Dylan. With Wetton gone, Asia continued. Downes kept the flame burning with new musicians, including guitarist John Mitchell and vocalist Harry Whitley. But the band, as most people understood it, the Supergroup, the original four, the lightning-in-a-bottle experiment from 1982, was finished. So here's the question. Was Steve Howe the reason Asia became legendary? Or was he the reason they could never stay together?
The answer is that he was both. And that's not a contradiction, it's the whole point. Steve Howe brought something to Asia that nobody else in the band could provide. He brought pedigree. He brought the name recognition of Yes. He brought a guitar style so distinctive that it gave Asia an identity beyond just another arena rock band. When you heard that guitar tone on Heat of the Moment, precise, articulate, melodic, you knew it wasn't just any band. It was a band with a master musician at its core. But Howe also brought the restlessness that comes with mastery. He'd already reinvented himself multiple times before Asia even existed. He'd played jazz, he'd played country, he'd played orchestral prog and stripped-down acoustic music. He wasn't going to stop evolving just because a pop rock song happened to sell 10 million copies. And Asia needed him to stop. The label needed him to stop. The audience needed him to stop. They wanted another Heat of the Moment, another 9 weeks at #1, another moment that felt exactly like 1982. But Steve Howe had never been interested in repeating himself. That was his gift. And it was his curse, at least for Asia. Wetton gave Asia its voice. That warm, powerful, instantly recognizable tenor that could sell a love song to a stadium full of people. Downes gave it its sheen, the keyboards that made everything sound big and cinematic and unapologetically 80s. Palmer gave it its power, the precision drumming that made even the simplest song feel like an event. But Howe gave Asia its credibility, its tension, its reason to exist beyond the singles chart. And when that tension left, whether by being pushed out or by walking out, what remained was still good, but it wasn't special. Not in the way the debut had been. Not in the way that makes you remember where you were the first time you heard those opening chords. Asia's story is the story of every supergroup. Too much talent, too many directions, too little patience for the compromises that ordinary bands make without thinking. The debut album was lightning in a bottle. 4 men from 4 different worlds meeting at exactly the right moment with exactly the right producer, hitting exactly the right cultural nerve. It couldn't have happened a year earlier or a year later. It was 1982's album because it could only have been 1982's album. And the thing about lightning in a bottle? You can't open the bottle again and expect the same storm. Steve Howe knew that. He'd been through it with Yes, the magic years, the decline, the reunions, the disappointments. He understood that bands have windows, and when the window closes, you either accept it or you spend the rest of your career chasing a ghost. Howe chose to keep moving. Wetton chose to hold on. Downes chose to keep the name alive. Palmer chose loyalty. None of them were wrong. All of them were right. And that's why Asia's story isn't really a tragedy. It's just the truth about what happens when extraordinary people try to do ordinary things, like stay in the same room for more than a few years. The supergroup curse is real. It's not about ego exactly. It's about the fact that the very qualities that make someone a legend in one context, the restlessness, the ambition, the refusal to compromise, are the same qualities that make them impossible to keep in a partnership. You can't build a band on 4 people who each believe they should be the leader. Sooner or later, the math doesn't work. Asia proved that in the most dramatic way possible. They had everything: the talent, the timing, the songs, the audience, and they still couldn't hold it together for more than 2 albums. Because the talent was the problem. The talent was always the problem. Steve Howe gave Asia its ambition. John Wetton gave it its heart. Carl Palmer gave it its discipline, and Jeff Downes, the quiet one, the constant, the man who never left, gave it its durability. He was the one who kept the name and the music alive through every lineup change, every feud, and every decade of doubt. Without Downes, Asia wouldn't exist today. He was their Carl Wilson, their steady hand, the one who showed up every time, no matter who else was in the room. But the magic? That existed for exactly 1 album and 2 years. A 9-week window at the top of the American charts. A handful of songs that still sound like 1982 in the best possible way. A moment when 4 musicians who had no business being in the same band created something that none of them could have created alone. And some things are more powerful because they don't last. Some things matter more because they were impossible. Because the people who made them were too talented, too ambitious, and too restless to ever make them again. That's the Steve Howe problem. And it's the reason Asia's debut album still hits harder than anything they recorded in the 40 years that followed. If this story resonated with you, there's another one you need to hear. A band built on the same impossible balance. 2 leaders, 2 visions, 1 sound that couldn't survive the very success it created. And if you want more stories like this, where the real drama isn't on stage but in the silence between musicians who can't find their way back to each other, subscribe. There's a new one every week.